Well, welcome to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. I'm your host, Big Tom Perkins, along with Dr. Cameron Meyerly. And I think today we're just going to continue our discussion on parasites, mainly the Barber poleworm. And I think we kind of ended up a bit with our concerns about resistance.
Yeah, so last time we kind of talked about just life cycle and why it's such an issue for our sheep and goat producers, here in the U.S. And then again, we mentioned it's a global problem. Um, but one of the issues or the points of concern or why we deal with it to the level we deal with it today is what we would call anthelmintic resistance. And anthelmintic is just a fun way of talking about dewormers. And so dewormer resistance, when we're thinking about barber poleworm specifically, is kind of what's given it the issue or kind of brought it up to the top of the list of just enemy number one. So, just I have an example in a PowerPoint that I use, just a very simple kind of genetic breakdown on how dewormer resistance occurs. And really, it's a little bit of a history lesson. If we go back and think about just veterinary advice, early 2000s, late 1900s, it was kind of common practice to prescribe dewormers on a flock-wide use at regular intervals. So, and certainly you can't fault them on kind of that thought process. If we're eliminating that parasite population every 4 weeks, then we really don't have the the negative effects of that parasite, because the thought is it's not there. We're killing it. And so the easiest way to remove the symptoms is to remove the problem. And so that was kind of the goal in thinking. The issue is, and again, pull this example out of how many times have you given a dose of dewormer or just drenched a sheep with anything, and they spit it back out, or they're fighting you on it, and maybe it's user error where you shoot it out the other side of their mouth, and hopefully we catch those. Then the other question is, how many of us are running those sheep across the scale to get an accurate weight to know what dose to provide that treatment at? And so all of those, labor intensive things are just human error portions are kind of what have contributed to the issue we see today. So underdosing, just widespread use of those classes. It's the same kind of conversation we have with antibiotics in human medicine. And why we have these what we'd call super bugs running around and causing problems. So it's kind of where we're at with our with our barber poleworm.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen a few Facebook posts where they have just recently wormed some ewes, and then these ewes were acting really funny. And then after answering a few questions from other people, it pretty much came down to the idea that they overwormed those. And I know in some of those wormers, it can be near fatal if you give them too much of it.
Yeah, so definitely our levamisole products
Yeah.
can have some neurologic symptoms. I don't remember the exact percentage over body weight that becomes an issue, but you need to be pretty accurate uh, with those dosage requirements on those lambs especially, and even on our ewes. And I would even say, like, have seen some things where well, we've wormed everybody and we've got these symptoms, and it's like, well, do you know that your dewormer actually worked? And I guess to finalize that first thought is, we're kind of left now with parasite populations that if we go out with a single class of dewormer um, and treat an infected animal or treat the flock, we can leave a significant portion of those resistant worms behind.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that case, if I go to treat one that's very ill, that needs treatment for survival, and it doesn't work, then yeah, I'm just might as well shoot it on the ground because the dewormer that is, uh, because it's not going to do anything in that animal. So it's not a good thing. Um, but I do think it has allowed a lot of individuals in the sheep industry, or forced them to pivot in kind of how we think about treatment. Um, Again, it's not a positive, but I think the end result could be beneficial for our producers, in maybe the way that we graze sheep, maybe the way that we treat individuals. We're more responsible with that medication, is my hope. And then also seeking, genetic tools to create more sustainable approaches to parasite infection. So, or the lack of a parasite infection. So, again, it's kind of forced our hand in a lot of ways. Uh, but if we kind of look at it glass half full, I think it can be beneficial. Um, Unfortunately, there's not a silver bullet approach to, like, well, we don't have dewormers now, like now we have this, and that doesn't exist. So we've got to be pretty creative.
Yeah, so it's my understanding, I guess that the worms that are resistant, that term is called refugia, and I only bring that up because I had heard that term several times and didn't understand what they were talking about. So
Yes, so refugia is actually just referring to the worms that are in the environment. And so instead of it being the resistant worms in the environment, they can be a part of that refugia. Um, our goal is to have, this whole thought of having refugia is this: it's the population in the environment, and I want that population to be susceptible to my dewormers. So my goal through selective deworming, so through our FAMACHA program, only deworming ones sheep that are heavily infected and have um, symptoms of anemia specific to barber pole. Uh, the goal is to deworm the ones that are heavily infected. The ones that are dealing with their infection, they're still spreading eggs, reproducing, the worms inside of those infected animals, but they're not seeing the negative symptoms. So we're putting out a parasite population with the goal that we are kind of overpopulating, and not overpopulating, but the percentage of the worm population in the environment, that refugia, is susceptible to our dewormer. So
mhm.
that when an animal is infected, when we treat it, we can actually see an improvement in that health category. So
So
yeah,
yeah,
refugia is just the population, and we want it to be more susceptible than resistant.
see, then I had that definition all wrong. So can you talk a little bit about the three classes of wormer that are available? Because my understanding, if you're using one class and I don't know, just say the name brand would be Sidactin.
Right.
That's is that the white one or is that the clear one? I can never remember. But anyhow, if you're using something like Sidactin and you're finding that it's no longer effective, and you go to another wormer that's in that same class, your uh, efficacy of that wormer is not going to be very good because
Correct. Yeah,
because
the
they
biggest
build up a
question is,
resistance basically to that class, not
yeah,
necessarily just
before,
that
and I
specific
think
wormer.
before you even get into the, like, the dewormer question, it's or what class, the biggest question I would ask is, do you have a problem in the first place? So, assuming we've already implemented some rotational grazing, assuming we've already implemented selective deworming principles, which again, those two things alone, I think, are very simple, and you can uh, gain a lot of ground back in the fight against our our resistant worms. Um, before you even get into like, well, do we need to switch it up? What rotation do we need? Is kind of evaluating a baseline of efficacy. And you threw that term out, and that's when we're thinking about efficacy, it's the percentage of the population that we're removing through treatment. So if we have an animal that has 5,000, a fecal egg count of 5,000 eggs per gram, and then we treat that animal because it has a FOMACHA score of a 4. We treat that animal, we wait, and then we measure that fecal egg count again, um, and say we're at 0. Then we would calculate that as 100% efficacy, meaning we were able to clear out from those 2 data points. We can state that we've cleared out. We're assuming we've cleared out the entire population.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have my calculator in front of me, but say we go back and we still have 1,000 eggs per gram, and so that would be 1,000 would be 1/5 of that 5,000 egg per gram. So
Mm-hmm.
we'd be at a 80%. We've
Yep.
taken 80% of the population out efficacy, which is below the rate in which we'd like to see it. So
Because
for it to be what we'd
that
consider
20%
effective.
then that 20% that's left could potentially be resistant now to that
Correct. Correct. Yep. And so the number that we're looking for is above 95%, I
hmm
believe. Um, and so like that, it sounds high, but do you want it to be any less? Like the only reason I'm treating is because this animal has a problem,
hmm
and I need it to work, and I'm spending money on a product that I'd like to work. So kind of figuring out like what have you used on your farm if you're seeing consistent issues, and maybe you're not, but just to get a baseline of, um, maybe we're using Sidectin and we've got an animal that has a FOMACHA score in that 4 range, and maybe we can pull some fecal samples on those individuals that we know we're going to treat. We pull that fecal sample beforehand, treat them, pull a fecal sample, you know, days after treatment, and then look at what our fecal egg count reduction um, looks like, and trying to evaluate that efficacy. And you had mentioned, kind of, we were talking some places that'll even take a culture of your kind of parasite population. And so you'd send fecals in, they culture those. Again, we'd mentioned grow them in an incubator for 7 days, or I can put it in a cup on the countertop. As long as I keep it moist,
hmm
I can grow larvae inside in 14 days pretty easily. Um, so they'll take that, they'll culture that larvae out, and then expose larvae to those classes of dewormer, and give you a profile of what's effective, and kind of where your resistant lies in your worm population. And so you had mentioned you had done something similar to that.
Yeah, we had sent ours off to Virginia Tech, and that was through a grant from the University of Rhode Island. I believe you can go on their website and find that information. But let's back up just a second and let's go through the exact protocol that you could do to see what the efficiency is, or efficacy, I guess, of your dewormer. So you're going to take an animal that you know has got a pretty poor FOMACHA score, and you're going to pull a fecal egg count, or you're going to pull a fecal sample, which is
Yeah.
which is pretty simple to do. The way we do it is we use a rubber glove. We go into that rectum with 2 fingers and pull out about 2 fingers worth of pellets. I think they want to have 2 grams. I think is what they ask for. And you pull
Yeah.
that
Minimum
out.
of 2 grams there.
Yeah, you turn that glove inside out with the manure on the inside, and you can label that. We label it with the sheet number, or the ear tag number of that ewe. and then you're going to dose that animal. Then you're going to wait how many days till you take the next fecal? 2 days, 3 days?
Yeah, a lot of that is dependent on class of dewormer. Yeah, minimum.
Okay.
I'd even say like 5 to 7. So kind
Okay.
of our protocol with um, if we're deworming anything, it's and I say if, and we can talk about genetics here in a minute. Um, I I don't brag. There's a lot of people that'll tell you, like, well, we haven't dewormed sheep here in 20 years. Well, they also don't tell you how big the compost pile is out back.
Yeah.
And certainly, like you can get away with not deworming. You may have increased death loss, and those two things come like they coincide. So unless you're taking the approach of genetic technologies and implementing some fecal egg count EBVs where we know we can put some immune function into those animals, improved immune function into those animals towards parasitism. Um, and then, if you want to talk about how you're not deworming sheep, um, we can start to have that conversation. So again, on the use side of things, we're not dealing with barber pole worm as a serious contender on our parasite list. We probably will lose some use to meningeal worm, and it's like the month of September. Uh, you're just watching, and it's almost every year there's an indicator sheet, meaning one that you spot, and we're trying to get better about grazing kind of around that that time of year, um, staying away from our wet areas. But that's in, I guess, where I was starting with that. If we have something to deworm, we're pulling it off of the pasture, and I'm treating it, and then I'm going to measure its fecal egg count afterward to make sure that my dewormer's working. Because if I just deworm her and kick her back out, if I know it's barber pole, I've femometred her, she's a score 4 or 5, and I kick her back out and my dewormer wasn't effective. Now all I've done is added that resistant strain of worm to that refugia as we were talking about.
Hmm.
And so I like to keep them in the barn, and it's again, it's not the flock.
Yeah.
So I've got that one or two that are at a 4 or 5. This is for example's sake. Um, I'll pull them off, and then 5 to 7 days later, pull another fecal, and then look at efficacy on
So you
those.
can, so you can pull that second fecal and you can send that off to like Virginia Tech.
Correct. Yeah.
Yep. And you can get those results back. And that can tell you how well your specific dewormer is working.
Correct. And was the culture that you sent off to URI, was that a like multi-class test?
No. So what we did was,
Okay.
I'm not sure what you mean by multi-class. So,
So I
so
know I believe it's Kaplan down at University of Georgia. And I don't know if he's still doing those. Um, at one point in time, you could send off uh, your fecal collection, and that was tended to be a flock wide kind of pooled sample. They'd culture it, and then they would expose those the infective larvae, to like they'd put them in wells with Cydectin, Prohibit, Valbazen, and they would look at like kill percentage in each
okay.
class of dewormer.
Okay.
Um, and then you'd have a whole profile of, well, Prohibit's effective on your farm, but Valbazen is useless, or Safeguard is working, but um, ivermectin we've got an issue. So um,
No, we no, that
yeah, that
wasn't at all what we did. But all we
okay,
were doing was just
okay,
trying to measure ahead of time the parasite load in each individual lamb. So we grazed a spot and purposely overgrazed that spot, left them there a couple of days along with the mature ewes, and then came back to that spot in 30 days, figuring the parasite load should be pretty heavy, and just grazed those lambs there. So basically, we were infecting them on purpose, and then kept an eye on them as soon as we started to see signs of parasitism, either through bottle jaw, which was a little late, or the monster scores. And then we would pull fecal samples on every one of those lambs, send that information, or send those fecals into Virginia Tech. Then they would send us back a report and tell us who was horribly infected and who wasn't. And then we enter that information into the NSIP program, or through NSIP. And then that would come back and give us, per individual animal, how parasite resistant they actually are. Because that is something in our breeding program we're working towards, as we want the
Yeah.
most parasite resistance in those animals that we possibly can get. And part of the way we do that is by retaining ewes that are highly parasite resistant in the flock, and bringing in rams that are highly parasite resistant to breed to those ewes, to produce
Yeah.
that are highly parasite resistant.
Yeah, and that's one of those situations, and we've kind of talked with the way that you're grazing. So, um, for us, those FOMACHA scores and dewormer treatments, um, in heavy infections are big culling points,
Mm-hmm.
meaning, and kind of, for individuals that maybe aren't selecting sheep for parasite resistance, and but they're keeping records of the individuals um, that they're treating.
Yep.
I challenge them to go back and look at, um, the list of treatment records, and are there sheep on that list for dewormer administration, that are showing up multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
And if they are, even if you've been keeping records for a long time, keep going down the line. Like, does that you have daughters in the flock? And
Yeah.
are those showing up on that list?
Yeah.
And so not everybody has an extensive list like that. But the individuals you talk to that are like, I've got this issue and it's really frustrating. And then they start to look, you kind of talk them off the ledge, and they start to look at the list of, or if they're not keeping a list, you tell them, okay, you gotta start writing down who you're treating. And all of a sudden they see that, oh, it's the same like 20 sheep out of my flock of 100 that are
Mm-hmm.
having problems,
Yep.
but they didn't know it until they just took the time to write it down.
Yeah.
Um, because it feels like you're just treating everybody all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the story that I've been told. And so from that, it's just frustrating. And then all of a sudden, they call those 20 ewes, and then they've got one or two a
Yeah.
year, and it's a freak thing. So, those are, again, simple things to move into that, don't necessarily take a lot of time, and can really produce a lot of result. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, record keeping is paramount. I don't know how you raise sheep without keeping records. I really don't. I know there's lots of people that do. Um, Geez, even back when I had cattle, I kept records because I couldn't remember what I did. You know,
right.
you think you can, but I've
Yeah.
never been able to. I've always been amazed when I walk on somebody's farm and they'll point an animal out and they'll tell me the entire life history, and they go back 5 or 6 generations. And I think, man, I can't remember any of that stuff.
Right.
But I have it written down.
Yeah.
it's it's written down now with NSIP. That information is super easy to pull up, and
Yeah.
I can go back through that. And on these rainy days when I don't know what to do, I'll spend a lot of time just looking back through that stuff, and looking at. I'm always looking ahead as to who I'm going to be culling. you know,
Right. Right. Yeah.
and
Yeah. And that's, so I guess where my question was headed, the way that you're grazing, so you're moving sheep every day, they don't have an opportunity to, um, become reinfected by the infective larvae that they are producing in that generation. Meaning, if I've got sheep on a pasture for, uh, say, 10 days,
Yep.
and we're hot and humid, and I've got my ewes out there, they're depositing uh, eggs in the environment. Those eggs are developing to an infective stage 3 larvae of Haemococcus contortus, and then we pick up those ewes pick up that infective stage,
Yep.
and now they've got additional worms
Yep.
in their system. Um, so you don't deal with that issue because it's it's 7 paddocks behind you by the time that that larvae is infective and ready to go. Not that uh, those larvae can't harbor over until you come back to it again, but you have some extended period. So my question is, do you feel that maybe some of those ewes and there will be a second part. Some of those ewes can maybe hide in the flock and get by with not having the best parasite resistance and still thrive in your system because of that management.
Oh, absolutely. There are ewes that I can go through and, especially when I go back through NSIP records that have just horrible parasite resistance. Um, I would think if you were grazing them in a continuously grazed system, they'd be dead in a month or so because they just have no resistance at all. But because of the way we graze, we're just minimizing the risk. We're minimizing that intake of parasites. And I'm sure they probably have a parasite load, but it's very low. And we're able to keep it very low with that. And we know that the longer that L3 larva is in the pasture is just another day closer it is to dying. And
Right.
if you can make your rest periods as long as possible, you're kind of waiting them out, kind of a deal. Not to mention, it's just fantastic for your grass and your root system and all that. So it kind of all goes hand in hand. So we strive for 90 to 100 days. That doesn't always happen for a rest period. And but the big thing is we know that parasite's going to be in somewhere in that 4 inch and below range. And so if we're going into grass that's 8, 10, 12 inches tall, um, most of those sheep are not going to graze down into that range. If you leave them there long enough, they certainly will. But we just really want them in there, taking the tops off, tramping everything else down. And then, tomorrow we're moving on to the next spot. It
Right.
and
And so I guess the second
that has been a huge game changer for us.
so the second part, you're talking about intentionally um I guess mismanaging some ewe
Yep.
lambs
Yep.
in what would be mismanagement in your system to get them infected, to try
Hmm.
to evaluate their immune function towards a parasite infection.
Yep.
Um, I, do you feel that that's absolutely crucial, kind of a trial by fire to see who possesses the ability to thrive in an environment that hopefully they're never going to see again on your farm? Um, but if they do, you're gonna be okay. As well as if they go to somebody else's farm and try to perform there, that they're set up to
Yeah,
succeed.
I think that the second part is the most important. I can graze sheep and not have a problem with parasites. But when I'm selling breeding stock, I'm not always sure where those are going to end up and what their grazing system is. And so I feel like I need to intentionally infect them so that I can get that data, I can understand that information. And when someone comes in and they're looking for breeding rams or they're looking for some replacement ewe lambs, we can kind of pair them up. And when we tell them that they're parasite resistant, we know that they're parasite resistant because we have infected them. and we've been able to measure that and see what the resistance levels are. I think there's always going to be room for improvement, and I think it's something you have to continuously look at. But yeah, when a guy tells me, "Yeah, I've had sheep for 20 years and I've never wormed them," that doesn't tell me anything. That doesn't, it doesn't mean they're parasite resistant. They could be grazing the same way I'm grazing, and if you're grazing that way, it's a good chance you're not going to have a problem. But and it just is kind of the same thing as when I was going past an Amishman's farm, and they're just continuously grazing. And I'm looking out across there, and there isn't a blade of grass that's any taller than a quarter inch or a half inch. And I kind of wonder, well, maybe they don't have any parasite issues because the worms can't live in that environment. Maybe the sunlight's just drying
Right.
out as soon as they hatch, kind of a thing.
Yep.
But you can't tell me that your sheep are parasite resistant if you don't take the measurements. It's
Yeah.
apples and oranges. It truly is. And we'll
Yeah.
just,
Well, and that
continue
being
to do
said,
that.
right. And that being said, I don't know that you have to be involved in NSIP to, I think you can be a commercial producer. Maybe you're buying NSIP rams, or maybe you're buying industry rams. Um, and I think you can have sheep that are parasite resistant or have parasite resistance. But you'd have to measure it. And it would be a continuous measurement, and it's a lot. You're still collecting the data. So, and that was kind of where we were at. We didn't necessarily start with the most parasite resistant ram in the breed when we first got the Katahdins. He did a lot of other things really, really well. Um, but kind of moving forward, we were looking at just being a commercial producer. I knew I wanted NSIP rams on the top side that had value, and it was to push in some parasite resistant genetics so
Hmm.
that it would kind of allow some flexibility in our grazing system, what you would call rotationally overgrazing
Yeah.
for for a lot of the application. It's still, not to sound harsh, but uh we put those sheep in a lot of environments where I need them to work for me, like in terms of brush control,
Yep.
in terms of like weed management, or forage suppression for a subsequent planting.
Yep.
And so there are times I knew going into it, there would be times that they would see parasites in the environment they would be in a paddock for longer than 7 days.
Yep.
And I wanted to have that, I guess, quote unquote, insurance policy
Hmm.
on in that genetic makeup, um, to really allow for some of those um, inconveniences in their life cycle, but to really make them work in multifaceted approaches on the farm. So um, it's worked out well for us, and it's something that's there's always more to learn about it, and there's always new stuff. I don't care if you've done it for 20 years. You hear something new and cutting edge. It's like, oh wow, we need to pursue that. So yeah, it's been fun talking about this topic as a whole, and I think just for the sake of time on the genetics, to get into the hardcore genetic, um, the immunology maybe portion of it, we'll save that for a later date.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to, because we're running up on our time here, Cam. My famous saying. And
I love it.
so we also want to let people know that we are receiving a few questions here and there, and so keep those questions coming, because we plan on doing an episode, I guess, for listener questions, and we're going to try to answer some of those. So if you'd like to reach out to us, you can do that by contacting me at bigtomperkins@gmail.com. And we'd like to thank you for listening to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. Be sure to get on whatever platform you're on there, and make sure you hit follow. And we'd like to build that list up if we can. And that'll give you notifications when a new episode comes out. So it's been good catching up to you, Cam. And
You too, Tom.
so we'll continue this discussion on in the next episode, I believe. So, all right, buddy, take care.
You too.
All right, bye.